Well, everyone, that was just incredible. And in each one of our keynotes on each panel today, we've learned so many different things, so many aspects of this problem. Like a kaleidoscope, if you turn it just a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left, you learn something different and unique, and you see the problem from a different vantage point. And so I'm incredibly grateful for everyone who's participated all day long. And we're not quite finished yet, so please keep your seatbelts on. We've got a high-powered performance just to close out the day in just a few minutes. And so let me just close out the day by trying to make sense of all the great wisdom we've heard. We started the day, and I asked this question at the beginning: what are we trying to accomplish today? And I said then that we've assembled a group of people who have been doing this work, and we want to have them speak to us based on what they've learned, what they've experienced. We don't want to know the obvious. We want to know what we don't know. And so here's my final reflections, really a summary of everything we've heard over the course of an incredibly rich day. The great writer and journalist, Professor Pam Newkirk, started us off with our first keynote. And I said then, and I'm going to say it again, because she was so crystal clear and sharp on what the main barriers are to achieving racial equity in the workplace. She talked about the traditions of exclusion, the traditions of racial narratives, of inferiority, of white supremacy, of the iconography of a nation that denies the contributions of people of color to the work that this nation has accomplished. She talked about these segregated networks where essentially the traditions of exclusion simply perpetuate themselves. She reminded us that not only does training not work in and of itself, and we heard others weigh in on this, but that in some studies things look worse as a result of training. I'm going to paraphrase Glenn Singleton, but he sort of talked about this as equity on the cheap. Or Crystal Williams, who talked about it as a crystal contingency, which is to say that sometimes leaders are willing to let one individual do something, but it's not built into the architecture of the organization. Pam Newkirk also reminded us about the civil rights backlash, that more or less within a decade of the civil rights movement, the effort to undo the civil rights movement through attacks on affirmative action. Theodore from Bayer from Brazil talked a lot about the explicit focus on reparative economic justice for Black people in Brazil. The intense focus on positioning them to have quality of life jobs in corporations as a way to address fundamentally their exclusion over many decades. The United States is not there yet, but it once was for a very brief period of time. And we've turned affirmative action into a vision of diversity that has lost its reparative, redistributive framework. And then finally, Pam reminded us about leadership, that this is really a leadership crisis, that unless leaders take on the obligation and the responsibility for doing this work and for signaling to everyone from the top of the organization to the very bottom of the organization, this work simply does not happen. So, she was not our only speaker, thank goodness, because we learned from Laura Marquez at Google how much data is important to the work that Google is doing, that you can't fix what you can't measure, although we have some nuance on that, which I'll speak about a little bit later. But for her, it's important that these metrics become baked into the business model for every part of the organization, so much so that they've opened up a public access pay equity formula that other people can use, that Google itself are using, to ensure that they are not perpetuating the racial wealth gap and economic inequality amongst their own. Tamika Curry Smith used this wonderful metaphor, borrowing from Damian Hooper Campbell, of the poetry and the plumbing of this work, that the plumbing is what's behind the walls, as Crystal Williams said herself, or the architecture. We have to make sure that the plumbing works and not just flowery words, because ultimately, if we don't hold leaders accountable, that's what they will do. They will speak to these issues rather than to doing the work. She reminded us that we must have end-to-end business decisions, that intention and integration must go together, that this work does not happen on its own, and we can't wish that it happen. We must make investments to make it happen. Mike Dillon, a retired PwC U.S. leader, reminded us also about systems approaches, that in the past this work was done one piece at a time, at the hiring level, at the recruiting level, at the promotion level. But none of these systems were ever thoughtfully put together to ensure that where we started in a company, often within the first 2 years where things look good, often pales in comparison, not to use a pun, at the very top. And so he reminded us that we have to do this work within the four walls of the company, but also the responsibility of the company to engage outside of the company is a theme that President Ruth Simmons also echoed. Crystal Williams, who led a panel, contributed as much to the thinking on that panel as well. As I said, she talked about crystal contingent work, which was in her own role as a DEI leader. Often people said, yes, we'll do this for you, Crystal. But then she said, but what about rewriting the rules, the policy, the practices and procedures? And that didn't happen. And what we see is that this work erodes over time as leadership changes. So she talked about changing the plumbing. She talked about the architecture. She also brought our attention to the fact that there is a body of research that should inform DEI work, and that too often leaders themselves are not reading that research. This research is not hidden, but in fact is available if people look for it. So she calls us to the possibility and the opportunities of learning the work of people like Frank Dobbin and so many others who point out the limitations of various training models. Kim Leary talked about so much of the DEI work is like trauma care. It's reactive and it's immediate. It's not ongoing and sustainable. She said that the health of any given firm ought to be aligned with the health of the people working for that firm and for the communities that that firm claims to serve. She said people these days are jumping on the diversity bandwagon and that companies are increasing their spending. 47% increase according to Fortune 500 over the past 3 years, and a threefold increase in ads for chief diversity officers in the wake of George Floyd. But she warned us that most change management efforts fail. They fail because people haven't been brought along. They haven't been incentivized or mandated to do this work. Because when CDOs come in, they're increasingly asking for a broader set of resources and authority to do their jobs. And if they sense that the job is really only about tokenism, about symbolic representation in the position itself, then they're not going to stay and the work is going to fail. So she wants to ensure that people understand that this is a moment where great change can happen. COVID has shown us that when people come together to solve a problem, things can move very quickly. So we have the data, she notes, Kim, but we don't have the will. And it's the will that we need to focus on in many ways what Glenn Singleton just talked about, starting with those courageous conversations. For Aria Florissant, she talked about the inclusion of justice, a beautiful phrasing. She mentioned that sponsorship is key to success in these organizations, and also that this is really a power conversation. We could talk about DEI forever, but if there is not power redistribution, if companies don't flatten the curve on how power concentrates at the top and in the hands of a small number of people, and often a small number of people who are least equipped, often intellectually and by experience, to lead this work, then this work is not going to happen. Tara Spann also notes that changing minds is an important part, an ingredient to changing hearts, and that you need to create opportunities and experience for empathy so that people understand outsiderness. This creates the conditions for change behavior. President Ruth Simmons opened our afternoon with a wonderful keynote drawing on a lifetime of professional experiences, noting that universities and companies can lead rather than follow, that leaders should move outside, as she noted, again, the four walls of their organization. You're noting familiar themes here. She said, remember, the problems of racism are at a most basic level a disrespect for other human beings, and that we need to be honest. She used the word truth and truthfulness constantly about engaging at every moment in setting expectations to end the way we have treated each other, and particularly how whites have treated blacks, grounding her own experiences in the sharecropping past of her own family. She says we have a lot of excuses for why we can't do certain kinds of things because we say it wouldn't be fair. But of course, the fairness is already, or I should say the unfairness is already baked into the world that we live in. She notes that we have to stop practicing tokenism. Token actions will create only little effect. That what we've been doing for decades is, if your way of addressing racism is tokenism, she notes, don't even bother, because everyone understands that as a sinister act. Focusing on the symbols also extends racial domination. Too often we reify the most heinous acts of racism, but that really just gives permission to the ordinary, everyday acts that continue to dominate others. We cannot make progress if we don't understand the nature and the extent of the problem we face. And so we have to speak truth to that power. I mentioned Theo van der Loo from Bayer and from Brazil earlier, but I just want to remind you that he insists that change has to come at the top, that it's no longer acceptable to have a pyramid organization where all of your low-income, low-wage workers tend to be people of color, and at the top it gets whiter and whiter. That we must focus on diversity and inclusion, as he notes, like a muscle. It must be exercised all the time, and these things must be done with honesty and fearlessness in conversations. The employees of companies want to do it, and leadership must embrace this challenge. Lori Villarosa brought to us a perspective from philanthropy by noting that philanthropy itself has the capacity to build the capacity of communities so that they can do the power building work, to do the political pressure work to change civil society. She notes, in diagnosing where power lies, communities have to be at the front edge and the leading edge of doing that work on behalf of our civil society, of which our private sector and nonprofit sectors are key players. Nia from the Boston Ujima Project expresses the world of labor relations. She talks about impact investing and cites 36 requirements for the Ujima Project in advising what kind of impact investing should happen. One of which is, of course, racial equity. But she names so many others, and I can't repeat all of them here, but I do encourage you to go to the Ujima Project and look up what those requirements are. She reminds us that people hold on to a mythic past are holding us back and need to rewire how they think about this. And that brings us finally to Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations, and again, speaking truth to power. We can't repair something we can't talk about. We have to recognize that absent culture, there is no transformation. He laid out 3 steps of consciousness, self-awareness, and empathy. He emphasized two keys, scalability and sustainability, and dug into a specific example of the Portland schools, noting that what success looked like was improving the educational outcomes for black kids. How did they do it? They did it by ensuring that they would have a staff at every level that reflected the humanity of those children and a curriculum that could speak to those children's reflections of themselves. And yet, to prove the point even further, when the Portland schools did not embrace those leaders and they began to leave, the success of those students also withered. And we are reminded here of how important it is to have political will for leaders in order to sustain and do this work. So, I must also say as I finish that the advertisements literally made my hair stand on end. And so he's got this secret weapon out there, which we know how powerful images are in shaping the world that we live in. So we want to encourage you, Glenn, to keep using that secret weapon. So let me remind you where we started this morning. It's my final comment. With all that we've witnessed in our lifetimes, embodied in the triple pandemics of COVID, systemic racism, and authoritarianism in the White House, our goal is not to despair, but to be honest, to be truthful, to rise to the challenge, to keep our heads out of the sand, but clearly focused on the horizon, and to promote the solutions that may require truly transformative work, one organization and one institution at a time. We will either wake up or keep hitting the snooze button. That's the choice we make, but I can speak for all of us here at the IARA Project. We're glad you woke up this morning and stayed with us this afternoon to be part of this conference. And with that, please, please, please stay for Clint Smith's amazing performance. Thank you.